Hello everyone, welcome back to MalStorm Gaming. My name is Malachi Gardner, and today I'm going to be going over my top 10 solo games as of 2022. I like to do this sort of video every year, just so you can always see the most up-to-date list of my top recommendations, and I always like to do this in line with the People's Choice top 200 solo games of the current year. So if you are not aware of what that is, I'm just going to go over it real quick. On Board Game Geek, there is a guild called the One Player Guild. On that guild, you have thousands of solo gamers who talk about games and have different discussions about them and different recommendations. Every year, the members get together and they create a list of the People's Choice, the top 200 solo games of a given year. So everyone submits lists of their favorite solo games of each year to the wonderful gentleman who runs the whole thing, Kevin, and his username will appear on the screen here. So everyone submits their list to him and he compiles it with different point systems to create a list of 200 solo games that the general consensus of the guild say are the best. And 200 games is quite a few games. There's quite a few recommendations on that list that get generated, but at the same time, there are thousands of games that come out every year, so these 200 games are going to be, the cream of the crop. So I have my 10 games here that I'm going to be going over, but if you want even more recommendations, I would vastly recommend you check out previous year's top 200 game lists on Board Game Geek. I'll link to the 2021 version as well as linking to the submission page for the 2022 version, so you can participate that with your favorite solo game. So that's a great resource for anyone looking for more board games, but if you're looking for my board games, my favorite solo board games as of 2022, that's going to be this video here. So, starting off on the list, my number 10 is going to be Enchanters. Now, last year, this was on my list as number 9, so it's gone down a little bit from some new additions appearing in the list. So, in Enchanters, you're going to be playing as an enchanter who is going to be crafting a very powerful magical weapon. You're starting out with a Fist of Enchanting, and later on as you play, you will be able to get more weapon, or more item cards, as well as more enchantment cards, and together that'll create your weapon. So an item card starts out as, could be a fist, which is what you start out with, or it could come out to be a warhammer, or a bow, or a dagger, all sorts of different items. But then the enchantment is going to add in some sort of suffix. So it might be, well, starting out is of enchanting. So you start out with Fist of Enchanting, but then later you might get fire. So you'll have a Fist of Fire, or a Sword of Fire. And as you play, you're going to be able to add on more and more cards that you're drafting from the center row in the middle of the table that all players have access to, and you're going to be adding on to your weapon, making it more and more powerful. The way this works is through a very clever system where each card has, the large majority of it, is just on the top of the card, but then at the very bottom of the card there is a line with some more statistics potentially presented underneath the line, and anything above the line is covered up with the new card as soon as you draft it, as soon as you draft a card of the same type. So if you have an item card, you draft another item card, you cover up the first one, but anything below the line is not covered up, and it's going to be affecting you for the rest of the game. So you can have a card that gives you +1 attack on the top, and then a +1 attack on the bottom. So as long as that's the top card of your stack, it's a +2, but then once that card is covered, it's still giving you a +1 to your attack. So you're going to be able to get more and more powerful as you play the game. And I love that system. I do really like Enchanters as a solo game, but I think it does work better as a multiplayer game. But I do still like Enchanters, so that's why it's on the list here, number 10. Now moving down to number 9, we have Puzzle Quest, designed by Brian Garber. And in this game, you are going to be playing as a brave adventurer going into a dungeon all by yourself. And you are trying to take out as many monsters as you can to complete your quest. Each hero you play will have its own objective for defeating specific monsters. You might have, the cleric going in, he wants to rid the dungeon of all the undead. Or you might have a ranger going in trying to hunt different beasts. And so you have different objectives you're trying to accomplish as you go through, and the game plays very similarly to a card game with a 52 card deck, such as like Spider or Klondike Solitaire. And in this game, you're going to be using cards that are in your arsenal deck, and that you're going to have certain cards you have access to at different times, and you're going to be trying to use the cards to defeat different monsters in the dungeon. And monsters are all in a 4x5 grid, and so you need to take out the monsters on the bottom before you can get to the ones on top. And so you need to kind of carve your path through the dungeon to take out all the monsters you need to take out. Whenever you do fight a monster, you get some sort of ability that'll go off, and then your character itself will also have a unique ability. And there are hundreds of heroes in the game that all have different abilities and all change the game and the victory conditions in just slight ways. And so each time you play, it'll be a different experience. Sometimes you'll be playing with a character who's really who can really take advantage of certain cards with specific numbers. For example, the 8s. I think it's the mage who can use the 8 cards of each suit for extra benefits, or maybe you'll have cards that you have the illusionist, where you like to play cards that have where you like to play 2 or more cards at the same time that have the same number but different suits to get more bonuses there. So they all do something a little bit different, and some of them even are wildly different and have completely different victory conditions, such as trying to discard all of the cards from your deck instead of fighting monsters. So lots of different options there for playing. So there's tons of replayability. And so that is my number 9 puzzle dungeon. For this year's number 8, we have Bullet Heart. The way this game works, it is very similar to like a bullet hell, shoot 'em up type of video game where there's tons of incoming bullets and you're trying to weave through dodging them while taking shots of your own to try to take out your enemies. The game can be played in both a cooperative and a competitive game mode, but I mostly play the cooperative game modes so I can play solo. And when you're playing competitively, your enemy attacking each other and dodging each other's bullets. But when you're playing a cooperative game, you and up to 3 other players are going to be taking on a boss character. And each of the 8 characters in the game can be flipped over, and on its reverse side is a boss version of that character, which is very cool. So you have 8 characters in the core box, but you also have each of those characters as a boss version on the back side. So that's a very neat way of doing it. But each character and boss all plays very differently from each other, and they all are going to be and they're all going to really change up how the game is played. But the core of the game remains the same, and that is that you have a grid and a bag of tokens. And each token is going to have a color and a number. And the color will determine what column you place the token in when you draw it, and the number will determine how many spaces down you place it. So if you have a red 2, it'll go in the red column, the 2 spaces from the top. But then, what's interesting is, if you were to draw another red 2, or even a red 3, you would count from the top, skipping over any spaces that have tokens in them already. So if you were to draw a red 3, you would skip over the red 2 you already played, and so actually the red 3 will be placed in the red 4 slot. And so as you get more and more bullets in each column, the bullets will be able to go closer and closer to you. If they ever reach the bottom of the column, they, instead of being placed, will actually go to your damage board, and you'll have 3 or 4 hit points. And if you take too many damage, you'll of course be eliminated. But you do have ways of manipulating the tokens, and so you'll have special abilities that you can spend your action points on to move them around, to move tokens around the board into different shapes and patterns, and then you can play pattern cards from your hand that will, as long as you meet the prerequisites for the positions of the tokens on your board, you're able to remove some of those tokens. So you might have a simple one where if you have 3 bullets all adjacent to each other in a column, then you'll be able to take out 3 bullets from the column to the right, for example. And so then, after you've taken out bullets, those are moved from your board and are no longer attacking you, and instead you'll place that as damage counters on the boss. And so it's very interesting where you're trying to, it's almost like a Tetris type thing where the bullets are all coming down and you're trying to move them to create different patterns, and then you can play your cards to remove those tokens from your board and deal them as damage. So it's a very interesting spatial puzzle type game with lots of variety. You have 8 in the Bullet Heart box, 8 more characters in the Bullet Star box, and there's a little expansion that has 4 more characters or something like that. So there's quite a few characters, and all those characters double as bosses as well. So there's a lot of variety in the game, and it's a really fun spatial puzzle. So that is my number 8, which is Bullet Heart. So next up in my number 7 slot is actually last year's number 5, and that is Spirit Island. Spirit Island is this amazing game where it's kind of the inverse of Settlers of Catan, where instead of you going to an island and colonizing it, you actually are playing as the island. and more specifically the spirits that inhabit the island, and you're trying to drive off those pesky colonists that are coming to your board and coming to your island. So the way it works is you have a spirit, and each spirit is very asymmetric. They each have their own different rules of how they play and different play styles, and in addition to having some special rules, you also have special cards that will also very much impact how your character works. And you're going to be able to play cards throughout the game that will impact the board, and each card will be either a fast power or a slow power. And fast powers will happen before the invader's turn, before the enemies get to do their thing. But slow powers, while being more powerful, you'll have to wait until the enemies have gotten to take their turn before you can take your action and play that card. So it's a very interesting thing where at the beginning of the round, you will become more powerful with different upgrades that you can take, but then you'll play out the cards you want to play, but then some of them you'll be able to do right away, others you'll have to wait to actually trigger them until the enemies have taken their turn and wreaked havoc on the island. So it's a lot of planning ahead you need to do, but what helps is that you actually know basically 80% of what the invaders are going to do on their turn. You know where they're going to ravage, where they're going to fight. You know where they're going to build settlements. The only thing you don't know is where the explorers are going to go. So where they're going to stake out and claim new territory. You're not quite sure where that'll be, but the place where they do explore this round, next round is where they're going to build. And the round after that, they're going to ravage in that location. So it's this cascading effect of they're going to do this, and then they're going to do this, and then they're going to do this, turn after turn. So they're going to explore, then they're going to build, and then they're going to ravage, all in the same location. And so if they explore in location one turn, next turn, you know they're going to build there. And then the turn after that, they're going to fight. So you need to prepare your defenses. So it's a very interesting system, and the game really functions on knowing what your opponents are going to do, and then figuring out, cooperating with any teammates you may have, or if you're playing, a two-handed solo, cooperating with the two spirits you're playing with, to have the best solution to the puzzle that is going to be each and every turn. I love this game so much. It is right behind me right there, and I have everything that is currently out for it except for the new Horizons of Spirit Island. Have not been able to find that at any Target nearby me, but I am looking forward to buying it at some point to get more spirits and everything. Each spirit is vastly unique, and you also add in different invaders. You normally just play with generic invader groups, but you can also play with specific factions. So you might be playing in Sweden or England, and each one of those will have its own playstyle and special abilities, and so you put all that together, and you have tons of combinations, tons of ways you can build out your character with all the unique power cards in the deck and everything. It's a blast to play. The problem that I do have with it, and the reason it went down a couple notches, down to number 7 from being number 5 last year, is the fact that it is so brain-burning, and it requires a lot of you to play. You're not going to be able to easily play this game when you're tired after work. It's something where you need to devote time and energy into playing. If you do, it really is a worthwhile experience, but it is a little bit harder to get to the table just because of how demanding the game is. It definitely rewards you for putting in the effort, but it's harder for me to find the time when I'm actually able to spend an hour or two playing this intense game. But I really enjoy it, and I always relish the times when I am able to play. So that is Spirit Island, my number 7 for this year. Alright, next up for my number 6, and this one actually didn't move at all from last year, is Dragonfire, which is right here. Now, this is a campaign-based deck building game set in the Forgotten Realms, the world of D&D. The way it works is very interesting, and it uses the same system of the Shadowrun Crossfire game system. They're very, very similar, and the way it works is that you're going to be facing off of multiple enemies coming at you in multiple waves. And each enemy will require you to deal different damage, different amounts of different types of damage to them. And so there are 4 main colors of damage. There's red, blue, green, and black. And each monster will require you to deal damage to them in a specific order. So you might have a simple monster that you need to deal blue damage to them and then a red damage. You might have another monster that's a red damage and then 3 damage of any type, another red damage and then a damage of any type in order to actually beat it. You need to do all that damage in that order. And so it's this really puzzly game where you and up to, I think it plays up to 6 characters. I generally play with like 2 characters, 2-handed solo. And so going back and forth, one player has these cards that he can play to deal some damage, and then on this other character's turn, he finishes it off by playing his cards to work well together and to be able to get in that final hit with the color that the first character didn't have. It's a very interesting system with having 4 different types of damage that each are used for specific things, and it's a fun system. It also does have a campaign element where from game to game you'll get a very small amount of experience points, but after enough games you are able to purchase features, which are special abilities in the form of stickers that your characters will be able to get, and they will give you even more special abilities that you can play and use throughout the game, which will allow you to face the challenges in different ways. And then, of course, being a deck building game, every time you defeat an enemy, you'll get gold, which you can use to buy more cards from the market, which get added to your hand immediately, which allows you to use them right away. So, I really like Dragonfire. It's a game that I really enjoy playing it. It does have a rather slow, kind of grindy campaign. I've heard a lot of people complain about that and want to, speed it up. And so there are plenty of ways where you can do that, doubling the experience you get, or so on and so forth. But the core game, aside from the campaign being slow, the core game is fantastic, and it's very puzzly, but not in a way that's brain-burning like Spirit Island did. It is a much easier experience, but it still has that really wonderful, crunchy puzzle to it. So I really like Dragonfire, and it's getting harder to find nowadays with Catalyst Games losing the license to the D&D property, but if you can find either Dragonfire or Shadowrun Crossfire, I would definitely recommend you try it out. My number 5 for this year is going to be Marvel Champions, and this was last year's number 7. And so Marvel Champions is Fantasy Flight's newest LCG game. So it came out in 2019, and since then there have been a ton of new expansions, and just a couple of weeks ago they came out with the X-Men characters. So they started out with their first X-Men characters with Colossus, Shadowcat, Cyclops, and Phoenix, and more are on the way. This is something, of course, that people have been wanting since it got announced back in 2019, and now it's finally here, and so far they're great. So hopefully I'll do a playthrough review of that shortly, but I am enjoying them so far. Marvel Champions is a game where each player will control a hero, and playing it solo, I generally play with 1 or 2 heroes, and you're going to go up against a villain. And each villain will have their own different scenario, different victory conditions they'll have, and ways that they'll win, and you're just trying to take out the villain, generally. The game is really fun. It's very fast-paced and very punchy. But the thing I like about it the most, out of all the Marvel games I've played, and I've played a lot, and I own a lot, and there are actually quite a few on this list coming up. And there are some that, while they're not on my top solo game list, they would be on my top games of all time. But out of all the Marvel games I've played, Marvel Champions is the most Marvel. It is the most thematic out of the games I've played. It's the one where you feel like the character you're playing. The characters each function very differently from each other, and if you're playing as Spider-Man, you feel like Spider-Man. If you play as Shadowcat, you feel like Shadowcat, facing in and out, and it is very, very fun and very thematic. And that also goes for the villains. The villains are also very thematic. And so it may not be my favorite Marvel game, but it is my favorite game for the Marvel theme. So I really like Marvel Champions a lot. Yes, you need to keep in mind that it's an LCG. It's Fantasy Flight. Every month, there's going to be an expansion coming out. In September, there were 3. It'll become expensive if you're trying to keep up with it all. But it is worth it, and it is very, very fun to play, and there is a ton of variety. Each villain can be modified with the modular encounter sets, and each hero has pretty extensive modification options with adding in different aspects where you can play different classes essentially for each character. So you can play more DPS focused Spider-Man, or you could play a more support, protection focused Spider-Man. And so there's 4 different aspects and dozens of heroes, dozens of villains. So there's a lot of variability there. It's a very fun game that's very thematic. So that is my number 5, Marvel Champions. My number 4 is going to be new to the list as of this year, and like Marvel Champions, it is another Marvel game, and that is Marvel United. Now, I have both Kickstarters forth of Marvel United, both the first and the second Kickstarters, although I did miss the Kickstarters for those, so I had to get those off the secondary market. But I'm very glad I did, because this is a very, very fun game. As you can see, I got it earlier this year, and it's already my number 4. And the things I like about it so much is how accessible the game is. It plays 1 to 4 players out of the box, but there's ways to play with a 5th player, and actually there's also some alternate game modes where you can play with 6 players. There's a wide variety of player counts you can play as, and I know this is a solo games list, but playing this game multiplayer is amazing because it is so accessible, and everyone I've played it with has had a blast. And there's not something to be said about a lot of these games on these lists. Marvel United is a game that I can play with most anybody. Sure, some people won't like it, won't be everyone. It's not everyone's cup of tea. It is on the lighter side of the mechanical spectrum, but because it is so light, it is so accessible. It's roughly equivalent to something like Pandemic. There might be some, this might be a little more complicated than Pandemic, but it's that sort of level where it is just very easy to teach people who've never played a cooperative game before and don't even play games that much, to teach them this game, and they can get a hang of how to play it, and they can have fun. And this could be something that can definitely get people into solo gaming and cooperative gaming. So I really like it for that, but looking at it specifically as a solo game, it's also a blast. It's very light, right? It's a light experience, much lighter than Marvel Champions, and while each character design is smaller and is simpler, you only have 12 cards for each hero, and most of those cards are just going to have symbols for different actions, and only 3 or 4 of them are actually going to have special abilities. But even yet, each character feels very distinct. It's much more subtle than something like Marvel Champions, where it's in your face how different each of the characters are and how thematic each of them are. But it's a little more subtle, but if you played enough characters, you can really notice the difference between each character. The more you play the game, the more differences in how each character actually plays will appear to you. And so that's actually really impressive with how much difference and variation that we're actually able to have in each character, even though each character is mostly just a collection of different action symbols. And so that's really fun. The core mechanic of the game is playing each turn, drawing a card, and playing a card. But the interesting thing with the game is that in addition to playing your card and getting the benefits off of your card, you also get the benefits off of the card that came before you. So if your teammate who came before you played a card that allowed them to move and then attack, you also get to move and attack on your turn in addition to whatever your card you play. And then your teammate that comes after you will be able to use the card you just played. And so there's a lot of teamwork and cooperation in that where, you need to move over here, so I'm going to play this card which allows me to move, but the main goal is to allow you to move on your turn, and then you can deal your big attack. So it's very fun, and there's tons of variety if you have everything. Even if you don't have everything, there's still lots of variation there, and so I really like Marvel United, and so that is why it's my number 4. So my number 3 for this year is going to be Gloom Haven. Gloom Haven, I'm sure most of you are aware of, is a massive, massive game. The core box alone weighs something like 15 pounds, and then you also have Forgotten Circles and Jaws of the Lion, and then of course Frosthaven is coming out very soon, just a couple of months. There's a lot of Gloom Haven. It's a massive campaign. It took me around 200 hours to complete the core game. And the way it works on a scenario turn-to-turn basis is very interesting, and I really like it, where each character is going to select 2 cards from their hand, and based off of the initiative values on the cards, Once you reveal those, you're going to determine which character or monster goes first, and then on your turn, you're going to do the top action of one of your cards and the bottom action of the other. But it doesn't matter which action you use off of which card. And this is really cool, where it's kind of like a programmed movement thing, where you're selecting your cards before you know what the other players or the other monsters are going to do. Before you know what the monsters are going to do. So you may want your brute to move, grab this chest, and then hit somebody with his sword, and then you want your tinkerer to create a robot and then heal the brute. That might be your gameplay. But then you reveal the cards for the monsters, and they're going to do something that completely messes up your plan. They're all going to scatter or do something like that. But then you're able to have the flexibility to, instead of using the top action of one card, you can use the bottom action of that card, and then use the top action of the other card, even though you were planning on using the bottom action of that second card. There's still flexibility in that. So it's program movement with flexibility, which is very interesting in the way the cards work as a timer. When you run out of cards, you die. When you run out of cards, you're exhausted, and you lose the scenario. And every time you run out of cards, you're going to gain all your cards back, with the exception of one card that you lose. And so you're going to be dwindling your cards as you play. But there are some really, really powerful cards that when you play them, you lose them instantly. So how many turns is that going to cost you by losing one card? It might be quite a bit, and that might just be too costly, but it's a very powerful action. You want to be able to do it to take out the skeleton so he doesn't hit you. So there's some really interesting decisions in the game, and then on a macro level, there is a ton of content in the campaign. As you play through the campaign, your characters will retire, and you'll unlock new characters with new classes you can play, and you're able to purchase enhancements which can customize your cards, giving them more speed, more elemental damage, and all sorts of really fun things there as well, and how you equip your character with different gear all plays into your strategy. And it's a very fun experience, and I really like it, and I'm looking forward to playing Gloom Haven, and I'm looking forward to playing Frosthaven when it comes out. So that is Gloom Haven, my number 3. Next up, my number 2 is Marvel Legendary, the deck building game. I've been covering a lot of the expansions recently, and just a couple of weeks ago, the Black Widow expansion came out, so you can look forward to seeing more coverage on that in the future. But Marvel Legendary is a fairly traditional deck building game where you start with a deck of really junky cards. You're going to be playing cards from your hand to purchase better cards that go into your discard pile, and then when you run out of cards in your deck, you shuffle your discard pile and draw from that. So then the cards you just bought are now in there. As you're playing, you're going to be adding more and more cards to your deck, and you're going to get more and more powerful, and your main goal is to take out the Mastermind. And you need to hit him 4 times to take out each of his tactics, and then you can win. The thing that is so cool about the game is how much of it there is, and how variable it is. Each game, you play solo, you're going to be picking 3 heroes, and you're going to shuffle their cards together and create the market deck. So each game, your market deck is going to be completely different. There are hundreds of heroes out for the game. Now, it's been out for 10 years, you don't need all of that content, you really don't. But even if you buy the base game in a single big box expansion, you have something like 30 to 40 heroes, and you have a ton of combinations there of 3 heroes. And you have a dozen masterminds you can play against, and a dozen villain groups and henchman groups. So every time you play, the game's going to be a completely different experience, and you're going to be having to build out to different strategies each time you play. And each character has their own play style, essentially. And so you're going to be mixing 3 of those into the hero deck. And so when you build your deck, you're going to need to choose what you want to actually focus on and how you want to deal the damage to win the game. So it's a very fun game. Playing the game while listening to a podcast or an audiobook, it's a very relaxing experience. And just buying cards and seeing your combos go off. It's a really fun game. It's this, and then my number 1 game are the games that got me into solo gaming, so they will probably always have a special place in my heart and in my gaming collection, and I will always enjoy playing them. Now moving on to my number 1 game, and well, it's been my number 1 game for the past several years, and based off of how much space it takes up on my shelf, none of you probably are surprised, but it is the Lord of the Rings, the living card game by Fantasy Flight. This was the granddaddy of all cooperative living card games. The designer, Nate French, was at a Game of Thrones LCG tournament. He saw some people shuffling their decks and playing out a mock game against a non-existent opponent, and he thought, wouldn't it be cool for that to actually be a game where you can play solo with the deck that you built against an automated opponent. About 11 or 12 years later, and 3 cooperative LCGs later, both Lord of the Rings, Marvel Champions, and the Arkham Horror LCG all have spawned from that thought. And this game is fantastic. The way it works is you're going to be playing through a scenario. There are a lot of scenarios for this game, and each scenario is vastly different. One of them might be a siege, where you're defending a citadel, and the other one might be you might be playing through the Hobbit scenarios, where you're trying to take out Bill, Bert, and Tom, the 3 trolls, and you're trying to bide your time until daylight, freeing the dwarves as they get caught, so you don't all get eaten. Each scenario is vastly different, but you're going to be building a deck based off of each scenario having different symbols that they pull from different encounter sets. You're going to be mixing those together to create your unique deck for that game, and each deck will have tons of villains and monsters and locations you need to clear out, as well as treachery cards that'll put wrinkles into your plan. And then you're going to build your deck. You're going to build a fellowship of up to 3 heroes, and then you're going to add cards to your deck to support them and to give them allies and attachments, and then add some events into your deck to be able to overcome all the challenges in each scenario and come out victorious. The game can be very difficult. Some scenarios are really, really difficult, and so you're going to need to keep on playing it and tweaking your deck game after game until eventually you find out just the correct recipe of your deck list to have the perfect deck to be able to beat the scenario. It is a blast to play, and I always enjoy it whenever I can pull this game off my shelf. There is a ton of expansions out for the game, so similar to Marvel Champions, it can be very expensive to get it all, but there is so many options for how you want to build out your decks. Do you want an eagle deck? Do you want to play with Radagast and playing with all the eagles? Do you want to make a Gondor deck where it's very strongly, where you're able to really strongly defend against the attacks there? Or do you want to play with a Rohirrim deck where you're leading a cavalry charge to take out all the enemies? There's a lot of different thematic decks you can make, or you can make some weird, archaic deck that isn't really focused on any theme, but it's more focused on a weird card combo. This is a really fun game. I would say it's the Magic the Gathering of solo card games. So the same level of deck teching and figuring out the perfect deck to beat the meta of the game. But the interesting thing is that each scenario in the game is essentially its own meta, and the cards that work against a specific scenario might be completely useless when you're playing against a different scenario. And so it's all about learning the scenario and what that scenario needs, and then building a deck to beat that scenario, and then you move on to another deck, another scenario, and you build a new deck, and you try to beat that one. And it's all very fun, and I try to play each scenario about a dozen times or so before moving on to the next one to really get the most out of each scenario, and it is just a blast to play. Most of the content is Lord of the Rings adjacent, where it's taking place in Middle-earth, but with a lot of the characters, but it's not canon. But the Saga expansions are canon, so you have a mix of playing through the books as well as playing through stuff that kind of was made up by Fantasy Flight, but it's all made up in a very respectful way that very much feels Tolkien-esque, that could have easily been in Lord of the Rings, and honors the lore while adding new stuff to it that actually really fits with each of the characters and how they all work. So I really like the Lord of the Rings card game, and I've done quite a few playthroughs on it, and I'm sure I'll do more in the future. So those are my top 10 games to play solo as of this year, 2022. I would love to hear your list down in the comments, and please consider submitting your list to the People's Choice Top 200 Solo Games. Again, I'll link that in the description for this year, as well as the finished list for last year. pretty sure the deadline for a subscription for your entries are I'm pretty sure the deadline for entering your lists are October 31st. I'll have to double check that, but you should have a couple of days still to submit your list if you'd like. And then I look forward to seeing what you all picked. Again, if you want to post down in the comments, I'd love to read your lists and we can talk about some of our favorite solo games. I hope this list was helpful to you and hopefully allowing you to find your next solo game you want to try out. If you did enjoy, please consider liking the video and subscribing to MalStorm Gaming to see more content just like this. And until next time, happy gaming!